afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
We are here at the Downtown Library with Katharine Ball. It is the 5th of September, 2019, and we're here to talk about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Would you start by telling me how long you've lived in Santa Cruz?
Well, I haven't lived here in Santa Cruz for some time. My family moved here in 1968 when I was 10 years old, and I graduated from Santa Cruz High School in 1975, and then I went off to college, started a career, came back to work at the Watsonville Register-Pajaronian newspaper in 1987, and my last few weeks on the job there included the Loma Prieta earthquake. Oh. And I moved back to the Bay Area in November, pretty quickly after the earthquake, partly because it was, so much housing had been destroyed. My particular place that I lived was okay, but it was very isolated, and my landlord's house, which was up on the point of a hill with a panoramic view of the bay, was basically left in 3 pieces because they had a concrete slab foundation and all their plumbing and wiring and everything ran through the foundation. So their house was uninhabitable. And my place, which was further back on the hill, had shaken like a dice box. I mean, not one thing was in the place where I'd left it. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, I was not home when it happened. But yeah, newspapers don't pay well. There was a lot to replace. I had an offer of a better paying job. I took it. I felt a little crummy. It was leaving in the lurch a little bit, but, you end up looking out for number one, right?
Exactly. So tell me the story of what you were doing before, during, and after the earthquake.
Okay, well, I remember it was a very hot, still day. I was irritated, and I knew it was for no good reason, and I could just not shake this irritability. The weather had affected my mood, the weather or the vibrations from the earth or something. I just remember being in a horrible mood and knowing it was a horrible mood and no good reason, and I couldn't get out of it. I was supposed to meet a friend from the Bay Area somewhere on the Pacific Garden Mall for dinner. The Watsonville Register-Pajaronian was an afternoon newspaper, so most of us worked 7:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., so I had just gotten off work. I'd gone home. I lived off Browns Valley Road out in Corralitos, and tidied up my kitchen, And then I headed out in my very new car, it was only 10 months old, coasting on fumes, to get some gas to come up to Santa Cruz and see my friend. And I was driving on Browns Valley Road. I had the radio on because the World Series was about to start. I was driving around a curve where the radio always kind of went staticky anyway. I was steering to the left, my car was going to the right. I was headed into an apple orchard, even though I was doing this, slammed on the brakes, and my very first thought was, the warranty had better cover this. And then I noticed the apple trees were shaking like a high wind, and the power lines were, going like this, and I think I faintly heard, squawk, earthquake from the radio too. And then the radio kind of went dead because San Francisco lost all its power. So I kept going because I had when you're in a car, you don't sense, how violent it is. And I was in a very sparsely populated area, and I got down to where there were more people standing along the road, and I know what the expression saucer eyes means because their eyes were like this. And I rolled down my window and said cheerfully, "We had an earthquake, didn't we?" And they're like, "Oh." And I kept going, on my little, mission that I was going to get gas and go to Santa Cruz. And came around the curve from Browns Valley to go over to Corralitos Road, and the bridge was no longer connected to the road there. And I thought, oh, that was kind of a big earthquake. And I made a U-turn, and at that point I could see there's a house that's right there at that junction, and most of the wall on whatever side that was, probably like southwest or something, had fallen out. You could see inside to the house from the side wall, and I thought, oh. And, you know, I went back home because I had no gas, and lived up this little private road off of Browns Valley. I remember as I was getting ready to turn into my road, I saw this bicyclist gesticulating wildly. He was talking to somebody in a car. To this day, I wonder what his story was. Because I think a lot of the redwoods had fallen across the road not too much further up. And anyway, when I got to the bottom of the road, which was about a quarter of a mile long, I could hear the propane tanks going whoosh, 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 whoosh. They'd come unmoored, or at least the main one for my landlord's house had. So I got up there, and you think, you know, I'm telling myself, be calm, you know, collected, you're a reporter. And then later you realize, oh my God, you know, I was absolutely hysterical. You know, I got up there and like their paneled garage door was sort of tangled up. You know, it had been closed, but it, you know, and their front door had come open from the shaking. And I opened my little place and just debris everywhere. You could hardly set foot in it. My mother, it turns out, had called at 5:04 p.m. and my landline telephone had flown off its shelf, landed in the kitchen area, and the receiver had come up. You know, it was one of the curly cord numbers, had come up while the phone was in midair. And she heard the earthquake, not knowing what it was, but, you know, then tried to call back and all circuits busy. And she's like, what happened? And she was in Southern California, about to leave work, came down to her car and said on the LA traffic station, the first word she heard was BART, so she knew something horrible had happened. Anyway, to this day, I'm glad I was not home to answer that call because I could not even see the telephone. It was buried ankle deep in broken debris. Everything in my kitchen cabinets had come out, shattered. I moved twice in fairly short order afterwards. I was still finding broken glass, you know, the second move in, you know, that was like interleaved with books and things. It was an incredible mess. It was also getting dark. I was very frightened because of this propane tank that was just, you know, like it had come alive. I had no idea how to turn it off. Somebody else pulled up at the bottom of our driveway who was going to check on some friends that lived elsewhere on the road. And I literally ran screaming at her, do you know how to turn off a propane tank? And she did, and she came up and turned it off. And then my landlords weren't home, and I started looking, is there something I can do to help their house, you know, preserve it? And I could see through their back door, which was partly window, that their water heater had come over and was just spewing. I could also see that the door could not be opened, but I was trying to open it, even though it was blocked. And then I, you know, dimly remember, oh yeah, the front door, it was open. You know, and I came around, and the only thing I knew how to do was turn off the water heater, so I did that. Anyway, long night.
And your power was out?
Power out. I had my little battery-powered radio, which I wound up tuning to KCBS in San Francisco because KSCO in Santa Cruz had recently dropped all its news coverage and was doing like easy listening or something. And there was some hapless DJ that was taking phone calls from people saying, you know, the signal's out at 41st and Capitola. You know, it was just not very helpful stuff. My telephone, after I found it and put it back together, was not working. I had no dial tone, so you know I couldn't call work. I had no gas. I'm thinking they're going to want me to work tomorrow. I have just enough to get into Watsonville to get to the office, so I'm not going to go in tonight. And you know I don't know if they're going to be there. I don't know what kind of traffic problems I'm going to encounter. Anyway, so went to work the next day, and then we went to work like solidly for 2 or 3 weeks. There was, we had to do not just the damage, not just people's reactions, but all the data stuff that people need to know, like how do you apply for a disaster loan? When is the FEMA office opening? What is FEMA going to do for you? All of that. So we were, we had a deadline of like 11:30 in the morning because of the afternoon publication. And I remember once Houlihan Road had been closed because it had a gaping crack in it, and I had like 4 things I had to do before 11, and that was the direct route to get from, point A to point B, and I just went around the barricade and got there and said, oh yes, that is a mighty crack, but there's a nice agricultural field right here where it's less, so I'm just going to drive in the dirt, and that's what I did. But the very first issue, I have to say we were proud because we were the afternoon paper and the Santa Cruz Sentinel was the morning paper, and we beat them out. We published first, and this was it. Big one hits home. And this turned out to be one of the fatalities. A woman who was killed by bricks falling from the bakery building in Watsonville. Her name was Elida Ortega, and she was on her way to pick up her grandson from something like karate class or something. So, and as our editor said, it was different to report on because we were all victims too. So it was very hard to maintain detachment. And the aftershocks, people think, okay, the earthquake, it happened, it's over. Oh my God. They were rolling through like every 20 minutes for a good 24 to 48 hours afterwards. And once the power came back on and you could see people's faces, you could just see people were done with having the earth shake. And there was another major one like 4 days out that really kind of finished off the St. Patrick's Church tower in Watsonville. I remember that. But mainly I just remember being insanely busy. And my final story for the paper, because I did leave about maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the earthquake, I wrote about how nobody could turn a blind eye to the extremely poor housing conditions that a lot of people were living in, because in Watsonville, the city inspectors basically had to go door to door to assess were houses habitable or not. So many places that had not been habitable before the earthquake got tagged, and a lot of very poor people were panicked over what this was going to mean for them. And there had been a fairly major earthquake in Mexico City, I think earlier that year, that had killed a lot of people. And so a lot of people were actually afraid to go back indoors, and there were a lot of people camping in Watsonville parks for quite a while because they were just afraid to go back in, and some of them with good reason. One of the people I interviewed for that story, for 4 years, her husband, their 2 children, her mother-in-law had been living in what had been a single-car garage with a dirt floor. Their water source was a hose that ran from the house. Their power source was an extension cord that ran from the main house. The main house got tagged, so they were, because it was an older one that went off its foundation. And, it was as spotless as a place like that could be, everything polished up, laundered. It was a home. So it made you realize a lot of people were suffering before the big one hit. And it sort of, in my case, reduced my own sense of suffering, because I had resources, I had places to go, I had a new job that I knew was coming, It just...
Put perspective on things.
Yes, it did. I remember the Sentinel got a lot of blowback. I don't have their paper, but this was their front page photo, which they blew up to take up like, all 6 columns and about 2/3 of the page. and people were very angry that they showed this woman's injury. And I think, originally reported she had subsequently died. She was rescued from Ford's department store, which had collapsed on Pacific Garden Mall. And she did not die then. She died a number of years later. So her family was upset, and there was just a lot of upset.
So from a journalistic perspective, a lot of the people that I've spoken to, lay people, got their information from the Sentinel, the Pajaronian, the radio stations in their cars.
Yes.
Where did you aggregate your information from?
County authorities, police, city authorities, observations, interviews with people on the street. I do remember the day after the earthquake, the Pajaronian was in a very dark building. We only had natural light in the lobby coming through plate glass windows, so we were all working in the lobby. And we had little proto laptops from Radio Shack where you could see like 4 lines of text. And you could transmit by telephone, and at that point we were part of the JP Scripps chain, and our sister paper was in San Luis Obispo. So 2 of our people, including the photographer, because of course we had film, we did not have digital, had headed for SLO really early in the morning down there to do the production and process the film. And then we were transmitting our stories, and we had 3, I remember, dedicated lines in the newsroom, one of them out in the pitch black, where you had to hook up your little Radio Shack number, where you basically had to memorize your story as you were writing it, because you couldn't see more than 4 lines at a time. And, send that to San Luis Obispo, and then our managing editor had the papers flown back, actually. He chartered an aircraft. And we actually came out right about maybe an hour later than we usually did in the afternoon.
That's amazing.
So we were very proud of ourselves. Yeah. But I do remember while we were in the lobby working, there were people standing outside looking in at us, waiting for the paper.
Really?
Yes.
Briefly touched on how the earthquake impacted your life, but do you think that it continued to impact your life in any way after you had left?
Absolutely. To this day, I don't like my gas tank to get very low. I filled it up day before yesterday, and I only had 2 gallons left, and I was thinking, you were cutting it close. Because the other problem for the newspaper was I was not the only person on the staff in that position. There was like somebody who had a quarter tank of gas, and that was the most anybody had. So the very first day, because you couldn't buy gas, all the pumps are powered by electricity, nothing was working. And it was an all-cash economy. So if you didn't have any money, you couldn't buy gas anyway, if you were planning to use a credit card for it. So we were limited in our radius, sort of what we were covering, and we had to do a lot by telephone because of that. I also always look, where is the gas connection, and I learn how to turn it off anytime I move. I have now the idiot wrench now that I'm back on, PG&E gas, not propane, and I know exactly how you put it on, and you give it a quarter turn. I always keep bottled water. I don't drink it routinely, but I always have like 10 gallons in the garage. I always have something non-perishable. I'm not quite as, hyped. I didn't actually use my non-perishable food, but like the pump for the well where I lived ran on electricity. Couldn't flush the toilet. I did get to the office very, very early until the water came back on. And I was probably not the best smelling person. Nobody else was either. And it's bad when you want your power to come back on because you want to vacuum. And I will say, everybody, PG&E, a lot of things wrong with them now. less of heroes than they used to be, but they got power back on for most of the county within 24 hours. That was pretty incredible. Yeah, and the other thing I realized is whatever you're prepared for, it's probably going to be something different. That, there's some things that are kind of sensible to do, like have water, know how to turn off your utilities at the source. Mm-hmm. But, I moved back to Oakland, and 1991, I was one block outside the evacuation area for the Oakland Hills fire.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Oakland, because of the earthquake, and they of course sustained, the freeway collapse and what have you. They had started what was originally called Neighborhood Emergency Response Teams, NERTs, and they changed it to CORE, City of Oakland Response to Emergencies. And you could organize a group in your neighborhood, and the city would give you training on like how to go door to door checking houses, what you should have to keep your own self sustained and things like that. So I organized that in my particular neighborhood, and to this day I still have friends because of that up in that part of the world. I don't think anybody does that anymore, and it's really too bad. It really is, because it's good to know who your neighbors are. It's good to know who the people are who will probably need help, because either they have a chronic illness or they're elderly or something like that. It built up the fabric of the neighborhood in a way that I think has been kind of lost in many places.
So you would say that you take precautions against natural disasters?
Yeah, but also, 30 years on, and having worked in the news business for most of that, I would also say you just never know what's coming. You don't know. And I'm a little more fatalistic, and I don't feel like it's personal. I think a lot of people kind of felt like the earthquake was speaking to them personally. No. It's just Mother Nature saying, I'm feeling the pressure on my spine today. I need to get out there and wiggle my shoulders.
How do you think that the earthquake impacted the Santa Cruz community or the Watsonville community?
Well, there was a lot of communal mourning, because of the downtown being lost, and I'm still friends on Facebook with high school classmates who still, miss the Cooper House. That was, a meeting place. It was a beautiful place, and that was like the first thing to go to the wrecking ball. And people literally were standing outside the caution tape, which surrounded all of Pacific Garden Mall, for blocks, crying. And a lot of the small business owners were really worried, and, I do remember Logos Books, which now is out of business, but, the owner managed to get the building built. He was the first person to reopen down there a couple of years later. So, it's a different place, but I think it's money more than the earthquake that changed Santa Cruz. There's just an insane amount of Silicon Valley money here. But when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the only chain store on the mall was Woolworths, a name from the past. Yeah. Everything was independently owned down there. Now even the chains are trying to hold on because of online sales. As you get older, you just sort of see, there's big things in time that you're not even sure are happening until you realize, oh my God, they happened. There's been this huge change, and I was just, riding along right with it. And then you have the sudden things that literally shake you up, like the earthquake, where you are pausing to reflect on what has my life been. I could have died. What should my life be? So I do think that kind of thing where you feel like you just missed it, really does prompt some soul searching for a lot of people. And, thank God I was here and not there. I'm thankful I was in my car on a country road. That was a very safe place to be, actually. my editor, who had 2 small children, she was saying, thank goodness we were out, because usually they were home watching cartoons at that hour, and they would have been sitting right in front of this huge, heavy cathode ray television, which would have crushed them. So, people felt either very lucky or like they just, they had a whisper from eternity that they, needed to do something with their lives. It has that, even in our very kind of non-superstitious era, or we like to think we're not superstitious, oh, are we superstitious,
It affects people in very mysterious ways.
Yeah.
What's it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
I can do it without crying. For years, I could not. And like I said, I've seen other things, and you get to an age where, people have gotten ill, they've died, they've had car crashes. You just realize life is precious. The earthquake is a big reminder of something like that, but you should be thinking of it every single day.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't covered?
I was going to talk a little bit more about the newspapers.
Please do.
I know the Register-Pajaronian, we got written up in the Columbia Journalism Review because in a couple of issues we actually translated a couple of our stories into Spanish, because there's a huge Latino population in Watsonville. Mm-hmm. And that was considered remarkable back in 1989. That,
wow.
The hometown newspaper, where there was no Spanish language newspaper, would even think of doing that and would devote the page space to it. And then I think what I was saying before we got started, I posted this on Facebook when I was getting ready to come here.
Uh-huh.
And especially journalist friends were like, how did they even come up with that? That's so sensationalist. And,
right.
and I went back and read the story, and an estimated 200 people were crushed to death amid the cascade of tumbling concrete and automobiles from the upper deck of the Nimitz Freeway, according to the State Office of Emergency Services.
Wow.
That's a source that you would rely on. It's not just some Joe on the street making that up. And I eventually saw, even in the Pajaronian, we had an AP story that said, 270 people estimated dead. And the final toll was 63. It was incredible that actually so few people were killed in such a wide area with, so many catastrophes. So it makes it over the years, it has made me more cautious as a journalist. Not only do you try to check things with more than one source, although in this case, who would the other source be? Because then you have the Alameda County Sheriff chiming in the next paragraph saying, oh, we're not even going to know, for weeks until we saw through all this concrete. So the first draft of history is really hard to get right. Really hard.
That's a great quote.
Thank you. And, even on smaller things, I became an editor later, working with new reporters, young reporters, trying to earn their spurs sort of things. And you can work all day trying to get a story right, and, and it's wrong. So it just makes me realize, yes, every single person has a point of view. It's hard to get accurate information at the best of times. When you're in a catastrophe like this, you're going to get a lot of wrong information. And all you can do is just kind of keep riding that avalanche, and try to stay on top of it and try to, when you get dinged by the rock, and admit, I got dinged by the rock, here's what, here's where that rock really should have gone. It's hard to get at the truth, it really is.
Well, if there's not anything else that you want to cover, I really, really appreciate you coming here and sharing your story with us. And